So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Dan Walker, at some point early on in the crisis, said that philanthropy has to step up. And of course, he and the Ford Foundation have. He said it's not about what you do with the 5%. As we all know, you have to give out at least 5%. It's what you do with the other 95%. I loved it. And I'm getting quite aggressive about one thing. We're talking about endowments. There are many institutions that have endowments, big endowments. And during this crisis, they closed down and nobody would touch the endowment. So I'm becoming quite an aggressive proponent. But guys, I mean, this is the time to use your endowment. Everybody talks about inequality and how Wall Street continues to do even better while Main Street is suffering. I would say one thing: let Wall Street do as well as it can. Let's not try to bring it down. But what we should do, and we have the ability as organizations, as boards, to say, okay, so Wall Street is going through the roof. Let me monetize that inequality and bring it in and help Main Street. It's a philosophical rebooting. And it started to me with Darren saying, what about the other 95? And he said, we have to change the way we think. We have to really, I mean, it's not a software update. It's a hardware reboot. If COVID was an excuse for all of us to move more aggressively towards that, so be it. But we have to move and we have to change our way of thinking. And what I'm afraid a bit, even though I'm an optimist, and I think we will get out sooner than what we all fear, to maintain that focus and that momentum on the things that we're talking about now while we're in the crisis. How do we at least use this crisis to make a better society for everybody and to prepare and thus be better prepared for the next one?
When we saw this twin crises that came to our doorstep at the start of this year, the one crisis of COVID-19 and the staggering economic and health impacts that we saw there. And then we saw a second crisis come to our doorstep. And that second crisis was the unneeded reminder of how inequitable policing is in different communities when the whole world had a chance to witness the killing of Mr. George Floyd on camera. We saw this as a society, and we saw Mr. Floyd's name being added to a much longer lineage of other names. And you realize that whether we're talking about the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 or whether we're talking about the impact of the need for policing reform, they were still all both centered around the central issue of race and the disproportionate impact that racism plays within our large societal frame. And so thinking about what then becomes the collective role of all of us, you think about the fact that over the past 2 decades, there's been a 400% increase in philanthropic giving over the past 2 decades. Also during that same time period, only about 10% of philanthropic dollars have gone to organizations that are led by people of color. So you see how not only does that dynamic show the measures of systemic racism that even exist within philanthropy, but it also shows it just doesn't make sense, because we believe deeply, as I know Andreas does, as I know many people in philanthropy do, that the ones who are closest to the challenge are going to be the ones who are closest to the solutions. That we still have a challenge when it comes to being able to put and get philanthropic dollars to impacted communities and leaders of impacted communities who are actually representative of the community. That there's an inherent bias in the way that we think about our funding and our funding mechanisms. And now part of that is because as philanthropy, we need to be okay with the idea of having a turnover or portfolios, the idea that we would have organizations that stay within a portfolio and there's so little rollover is a challenge. Because while our capital should be patient, our capital should not be permanent. Because also what that does is it closes off access for new organizations and new leaders to be able to come into our portfolios. At the same time, we need to be deliberate about being able to find and fund and support organizations that are led by people of color and to be able to support those leaders as well. The reason for the creation of the Power Fund was about saying, how can we be deliberate about identifying organizations that are led by people of color and not just getting them the financial support to be able to grow the organizations, but doing it because we believe deeply by supporting these organizations and these leaders, you're actually going to decrease the problem. And that we need to embrace this level of self-determination, that leaders of color can bring proximity, that leaders of color often better understand the needs and the assets of the communities that they serve, that leaders of color are more apt to make connections between race and outcomes and inequities, that they recognize systemic issues of racism and often have better coping mechanisms and tested solutions to succeed despite these systemic obstacles. Add a very intentional racial justice lens in the way that we're thinking about this work, in the way that we're not just supporting the organizations, but also coming up with self-directed leadership mechanisms for the leaders themselves. Because as important it is for their organizations to be able to grow and build, it's also just as important that we're supporting these individual leaders, because they will make a substantial impact on our society, not just in the now, but also in the going forward. And so we're proud of the fact that with the Power Fund, it was a very deliberate, a very full-throated, a very quick response in moving in data and moving in quickness to be able to understand that we have a fundamental, inherent, and unjustified bias issue within the world of philanthropy. And this is something that's not just about how can we give one-time grants to organizations or one-time grants to individuals, but I think as Andreas beautifully pointed out, this is about how are we altering our entire portfolio going forward. Because the Power Fund is going to be an incredibly important tool about how Robinhood thinks about its work going forward and how Robinhood continues to try to lead in this area and lead in this time to be able to say that our portfolio should reflect not just the communities that we're trying to serve, but our portfolio should truly reflect the best punts that we can make about how we're actually addressing the problems that we see standing in front of us.